Hi, it's Len. Today is September 6th, 2019, and this is a fireside chat version of the Kindle Chronicles because we're here at the cottage in Maine, and it's been cold enough to set a nice fire in the fireplace. Been burning all night. Darlene just went up to bed, but she did talk to me a little bit after my conversation with Brad Stone, and so you'll have that to look forward to in this episode, as well as some news about color e-ink, something we've heard a lot about off and on over the past decade. There's an update on that, and I'll have a couple of tech tips for you. It is a mellow room here. I'll give you a little sense of it. It's got beadboard paneling. It's natural wood. It's an old cottage. It goes back to the 1880s, and it feels like it's set back in time. A couple of couches and a nice fireplace that Darlene and a friend painted a turquoise color, so it's a very colorful pastel fireplace. And we look out onto the porch. The doors are closed because it's kind of cold, so we can't hear the surf. And we've got nice dry wood from a couple of years ago. We bought a cord of wood, and so there's none of that sizzling sound to it. It's a thump sound of the wood burning, and a pretty nice presence. So glad you're here to join me, and we'll. Here's the teaser for the interview with Brad. One of the things he's talking about in the sequel to his book, The Everything Store, is Amazon's culture.
You can't argue with the fact that it's a highly productive culture, that Amazon, continues to innovate and disrupt other businesses in a lot of different areas.
Got a couple of news items to talk to you about tonight. The first comes from good e-reader Michael Kozlowski, who continues to have excellent sources in finding out what's coming in the world of technology. And I think that's partly because his e-reader blog now also has some products that he's actually involved in some manufacture. Interesting guy. He's been on the show a while back. But he had a story in August, this was August 31st, that e-ink, the company that created the screen for the Kindle back 11 years ago, is working on color e-paper. Now, I remember this from close to 10 years ago. I did some interviews out at e-ink. They had a facility outside Boston. Of course, the company got started as a spin-off from the MIT Media Lab. And so at that time, there was color, and it was just sort of washed out. It looked like sort of old comic book type color, and it was hard for me to imagine it was really going to make much of a splash. And it turns out, based on the story by Michael, that e-ink has invested more than $600 million on color e-paper in the past 10 years, and including those earlier efforts that resulted in the kind of washed out version of it. He writes, e-ink has confirmed with good e-reader that they are working on a number of color e-paper solutions that should appeal towards mass market products. And they've invested. One interesting, these stories, when you cover this topic for long enough, you start seeing stories you remember from a while ago. Part of their work on color e-paper was an investment in Plastic Logic, and that was a company that had a tablet called the Q Reader, QUE, which I had a chance to see at the January 2010 Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas. And there was just a huge crowd of people because it was a very cool tablet. It looked kind of like this remarkable tablet that I'm using here for my notes for the show. It was an e-ink tablet, and everybody knew that the iPad was coming out. The iPad was released, I think, in April of that year. So in August of that year, Plastic Logic announced that it just wasn't even going to produce this tablet called the Q Reader. But it did some other technology, and a part of that apparently is being used by e-ink in its pursuit of a color e-paper that would actually be feasible. Michael spoke with e-ink president Johnson Lee, and he refuted an article in Digitimes that had said color e-paper will be ready in 2020. There's no official release date has been set. Michael, in his story, says probably not next year, maybe 2021. he ends the story by saying e-ink is basically very bullish about color e-paper and says it's their destiny to make it right. They need to get color working to land big contracts from Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, Onyx, Boyu, and other players. At least we know they are serious now about color. This is very interesting, of course. I always picture that there's going to be a pretty tough design choice for Amazon if e-ink or possibly some other company does get this technology right, to the point where you can change the screen quickly enough on an e-ink reader like a Kindle with a color screen so that you could actually be playing video. And at that point, it's what's the difference between it and an iPad, and where is the purpose-built technology that kind of takes you away from all your screens and gives you a chance to read in the way that the Kindle can be read in a focused way. But I'm sure there'll be a way to deal with that, and the technology, when it arrives, if it's affordable and it's bright and you can read it, in the sunlight on the beach, I'm sure there are going to be uses for it, and I would expect that Amazon would be leading the way on it when it comes. Second news story. Digital Book World sent out an email this week saying that they had sold all of the tickets for their event coming up actually next week in Nashville. And the Lowe's Vanderbilt Hotel, where it's being held this year, they made 12 more tickets available. I'm sure those were taken up fast. Bradley Metrock and his team at Score Publishing have done a great job promoting the conference. I realized that as I was leaving Nashville last year, they were already talking about the 2019 conference, and then throughout the year they've really assembled a pretty impressive lineup of speakers and conferences and events at this conference in Nashville. This brings me to a programming note, because I had planned to go to Nashville, fly down early enough Monday morning to be at some of the pre-sessions. There were some good Alexa sessions I was looking forward to going to. But I had to decide today to cancel the trip. Today is the 1 month anniversary of my mom's passing. It was August 6th. Time is playing tricks with us. It seems to be racing by and standing still at the same time. And my dad's doing okay, but he's 92, and he's been having some challenges that make me just not want to be in Nashville this week, when if he needs me to come down to where he's living, I can get down there in less than 2 hours here from Maine, and we'll be back in Cambridge soon. So decided it was just not a good decision to spend 4 days that far away from home in this time. Luckily, I had David Peach all lined up with press credentials for the conference. David helped me out last year, and we did sort of a tag team coverage of the Digital Book World 2018. So we Skyped today, and he is going to do the full coverage of the conference for me. And he knows how to edit in Audacity. He's got great microphones. He does a lot of work for his church that involves putting up videos, helping people to understand how to communicate with the deaf people in the sign language. So I said, how about if you just go there and you cover interesting topics and meet with people that you think would be fun to talk to, and send me 30 or 40 minutes of an MP3 file on Friday in time for me to put it up on the show. And I might try to connect with them just to have a little conversation, and I'll introduce it and all. But that's going to be a great thing for me to be able to subcontract the most of the content for next week's show from Digital Book World to David Peach, and I'm sure he's going to do a great job with it. Before the tech tips, I'm going to put a log on the fire here, so just to give me a minute here. I love the aesthetics of a fire, but I tell you, the action of placing the logs on a real fire, that's at least 50% of my pleasure in having a fire in the fireplace here in Maine or anywhere else. And you drop the log on at just the right angle so you can expect the flames to start coming up and licking it. And if you poke the logs, then you can kind of shake the coals loose. And I've been doing this ever since I was a boy, and I don't know exactly why it's so pleasurable. It may be kind of a primal thing that our species has been tending fires for thousands of years, and when I find myself in a place that has a real fireplace as opposed to one of those gas log things which I can't abide, it's really a pleasure. But the other thing I realize is if you really had to depend on keeping a fire going all night to stay warm in the 1800s or 1700s or something, I don't think you'd be getting much sleep because the fire tends to go down pretty quickly. Tech tip. Let's see what we've got for tech tips. The first tech tip is that I found a cover for the new Oasis. That's the 10th generation Oasis that was introduced in July. And I've talked about the covers on this before. The Amazon cover that you can get for this Oasis is nice. It doesn't have the magnetic clasp of the earlier generation, so you have to kind of press it in the way you do most covers for Kindles. It's attractive, and I've got a nice leather one. But what I missed from the previous generation Kindle's case was that there wasn't a way to do kind of an origami fold so that I could set the Oasis up, say, at a coffee shop or on a table to read. Well, I found one that's a third-party case that's made by a company named Fintie, Fintie. They're at fintie.com. And at the website, at Amazon, I was able to find it's a Fintie slim shell case for $10. Pretty good buy. It's probably a little heavier than the Amazon case for the Oasis. Not quite as this one isn't. It's maybe got a little bit of a leathery feel, but not as much as the one that I had before, which was much more expensive, by the way, as well. But it does fold up in a clever way in the back, so I can just set it up here, and it will settle in kind of like it's on a stand, and that way it's there are different situations where that's definitely a pleasant way to read. I'll have a link to it in the show notes, and if you're interested in it, also fits the Generation 9 case, but I think that those cases on the Generation 9 from Amazon, they do fold back so they can do that. So this is a solution to the problem. If you've got the newest Oasis, which I like quite a bit because I do like that sepia color. It's a little warmer light that's available. And now that I've solved the problem of having one of these origami cases for it, I think I'm going to be pretty happy with it. Another tech tip I received from Garrett Riley, we were talking about, I think, probably the Apple credit card, which, of course, I've been trying out and enjoying. He noted something that I didn't know existed. It's called Amazon Reload, and it's something where Amazon lets you connect your checking account with a debit card. You have to also, I think, give them your driver's license number. And if you put, say, $100 into the account, then they give you 2% sort of a bonus. So if you transfer $100 from your debit card account to Amazon, it shows up immediately, or within 5 minutes, they say, that's $102 that you have to spend. This has to do with the charges of credit cards. They're sort of short-circuiting the credit card companies by doing this, and so they're passing along some of the savings to you. And kind of an interesting idea. If I have the Amazon Prime card, which I think I'm getting at least 2%, sometimes 3% of money back to spend on Amazon. I get deals at Whole Foods. I think I get a 5% discount there when I use that card. So I'm not really a good candidate for trying this, but I'll have a link to it in the show notes. It's called Amazon Reload, and thanks to Garrett Riley for telling me about it. One thing to note is that you have to be a Prime member to use Amazon Reload, but I'm sure most of you listening to this are Prime members. Last tech tip is something which Lady A can do, and we'll see if I can demonstrate how this works. This is my third try at getting this to work, and it's a little frustrating. I think maybe it isn't rock solid yet, but this is the way the command goes. Alexa, remember that my coffee cup is in the dining room.
Did you just say that my coffee cup is in the dining room?
Yes.
Okay, I'll remember.
So now if I'm wandering around the house and I can't remember where I left my coffee cup, Alexa, where did I put my coffee cup?
You asked me to remember. My coffee cup is in the dining room.
Okay, so that's how it works. This is a clever new thing that she can do. I think the trickiness of the syntax underlines a point that James McQuivey has made in the past, which is that forward progress is going to be more natural language than having to remember a certain command. In other words, when I tried saying, remind me that my keys are somewhere, that didn't work. That generated a different kind of a command where she wanted to remember something that she would tell me about at a certain time for my calendar. So the syntax is, Alexa, remember that my coffee cup is in the dining room. I'll have a link to the story in Lifehacker that talks about this in the show notes. Time now for the interview. A graduate of Columbia with a BA in English, Brad Stone is a gifted writer whose career as a technology journalist began at the New York Times in 2006. I remember an early thrill for me in the early days of the Kindle Chronicles came when Brad reached out to ask me questions for a story that he was working on at the Times, probably about the Kindle, although I can't remember the specifics of it. I also saw him at Amazon product announcement briefings, and most recently I ran into him while covering the Remars conference in Las Vegas. Since 2010, Brad has written for Bloomberg Business Week, where he now runs global technology, a team of more than 50 reporters and editors around the world. His title is Senior Executive Editor. In 2013, Little Brown & Company published Brad's first book, The Everything Store, Jeff Bezos and the Age of Amazon. It has been translated into 30 languages and was chosen as the Financial Times Goldman Sachs Business Book of the Year. His next book was The Upstarts, How Uber, Airbnb, and the Killer Companies of the New Silicon Valley Are Changing the World. That was published in 2017. Now, his next book, which he told me about when I was at Remars, is going to be a sequel to The Everything Store, and I can't wait to read it. I hope you'll enjoy this brief chat that I had with Brad by Skype between Maine and San Francisco on Tuesday, September 3rd. I know he's a busy guy, so I misread, I think, an email in which he appeared to be saying that he only had 10 minutes to do the interview, and I think that I was just getting the time zones mixed up. But anyway, this is the shortest interview I think I've done so far in the show, and it gave me maybe this is a good thing to do in the future because I really focused my questions. I didn't. I went right to the things I knew I wanted to talk to him about, and I was mindful of finishing up by 10 minutes, so that's what we did. I started out mistakenly calling his work in progress a rewrite of The Everything Store.
It's by no means a rewrite. It is a sequel. So the first book was really the beginning of Amazon's story. You know, there's some of the biographical information on Jeff Bezos, his time on Wall Street, how he started Amazon, and really I'd say, the first 20 years of Amazon history. And it was published in November of 2013. And as you remember, Amazon was a comparative midget back then. It was, $150 billion business and maybe 150,000 employees. And now it's nearly $1 trillion business and, over 700,000 employees. And it's a much different company. And so I'm resuming the story. It's the story of Alexa and the Amazon Go project and their international expansion and AWS and the explosion in the Amazon marketplace and all that stuff. And then, of course, society coming to grips with this technology giant in its midst.
You had some pretty intense personal stuff in the first book, Finding Jeff's Biological Father, etc. Will you be writing about the divorce?
That's you're getting right to the heart of the matter, Len. This is really, it's a business book. This is, I see mostly, what I'm doing here as a biography, but a biography of Amazon. And it's the story of the business and how it's grown, and the ingenuity and the technical chops that were applied to the challenge of growing an already big company. Now, Jeff is synonymous with Amazon, and his story has always been woven throughout the Amazon story. So, I haven't really thought how I'll do it, but obviously, over the last year, his personal saga has impacted a little bit how people view the company. So I don't know that I could not mention it, but certainly that's not where I'm spending my time. I'm spending my time right now trying to figure out, okay, well, how did this company how did a retailer establish a leadership position in AI and voice computing and facial recognition, and how did a retailer really spin up a marketplace that has implications for small businesses around the world?
I remember an interview that Jeff did with the Business Insider guy at a time when McKinsey had famously dissed your book. And Jeff, even in light of that, saying, hey, I hope you're not trying to get me to oppose my wife here, but he said he thought that your book then was the best description of Amazon's culture that he had seen. And since then, Amazon's culture has been in the news, famously in the New York Times article. Is it a ruthless place? Are people crying? Do you see kind of tracking where the culture is now at 700,000 employees versus 100 or whatever it was as part of the story?
Absolutely, and it's something that continues to fascinate me. I mean, yes, on the one hand, I think I wrote a little bit about it in my book, and then in subsequent portrayals, it can be a difficult place to work. People say they work harder there than they do anywhere else in their career. Some people have great experiences, some don't, but you can't argue with the fact that it's a highly productive culture, that Amazon, continues to innovate and disrupt other businesses in a lot of different areas. And so, looking at how they've adopted to some of the criticism is interesting to me. Whether they have slowed down at all or made it a friendlier place, some people say they have, some say they have not. Those questions continue to fascinate me.
The other prescient topic you had in the book was the whole antitrust threat sometime way in the future, and you found that famous memo in which Bezos seemed to be thinking, what does Amazon have to look like to the public in order to get a little bit of a buffer against that, and stressing innovation and all that. How would you grade Amazon's last 6 years in positioning themselves for now talk about antitrust that's coming from the campaign trail and other places? It seems to be a much more present threat or possibility to them than it certainly was 6 years ago.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think in the context of that memo, the Amazon.love memo, they've done as much as they can to put the halo of innovation over the company. I mean, things like Alexa and the Amazon Go store clearly do associate Amazon with an innovative environment. And yet they've made some terrible mistakes, I would argue, over the last couple of years. First and foremost, maybe the HQ2 saga, where, they didn't quite understand or perceive that the political environment was really shifting against big tech companies. And it's remarkable the extent to which, our political parties right now agree on almost nothing except for that big tech companies should be regulated. And so I think we're right at the beginning of this process that's underway, not just inside the FTC and the DOJ as they look for antitrust possible cases to bring against Amazon, Google, Facebook, but the conversation on Capitol Hill, where Republicans and Democrats do seem to agree, that they need to do something to kind of temper the unaccountable power of the tech companies. And what that means, really in relation to Amazon and what impact it will have on its business is entirely unknown at this point. So I'm taking my time with this book. I'm viewing this as a project that'll, keep me busy at least through 2020. And so I think it's going to be interesting to watch that unfold, and whether, what in what direction it goes after the next presidential election, and whether Congress can really get its act together to do anything. And then if so, who does that impact? Does it impact Amazon, or, are there companies like Facebook and Google, because they're advertising businesses and have more of a kind of privacy impact, will they be the first targets?
Do you see consideration of the Washington Post ownership by Bezos as part of this book about Amazon, or something kind of off the screen?
Well, back to your question about his personal life, it's kind of hard to disassociate it, right? Because clearly some scrutiny, particularly from President Trump, has come because of his ownership of the Washington Post. And, it's one of the ways in which Jeff in 2019 is different than Jeff Bezos in 2013. He's because he's the wealthiest man in the world now, because of his ownership of the Washington Post, because of the philanthropic stuff he's doing, because he's now an object of interest from tabloid newspapers. It's a totally different situation right now. And so looking at that and looking at the impact that has on Amazon, I think probably is part of this narrative as well.
Last question. When I talked to you 10 years ago almost, you were reading on a Kindle too. You were noticing that you read more than you did before. You were still getting your newspapers delivered in print on your doorstep. What's your profile as a reader of books and newspapers currently?
Yeah, no, good question. And I'm sort of curious what your answer to this is also, Len. But it's funny. Because I live in the city of San Francisco, I've had my car broken into twice over the last year. And the reason I bring that up is because I did have, now what's the high-end Kindle? I think it's the Kindle Oasis.
Right.
Is that right? Okay, yeah. So I had that. It got stolen from the first break-in. Then I replaced it with the Kindle Paperwhite. And that got taken like 2 weeks after. But I was sort of happy about that because I did favor the Oasis. So then I sucked it up, bought another Oasis. So I'm reading on that. But despite the fact that I'm now funneling money into Kindles, I feel like the pendulum has switched and I'm going back to more reading of physical books. That's been my trend. I sort of go back and forth, but I would say more physical books now than Kindle. How about you?
Still probably 99% Kindle. Austin Kleon's latest book, Keep Going, kind of an icon. I use it sort of in a meditative way. I like it on paper. Newspapers, strictly digital. Are you still getting paper newspapers delivered?
I get the Sunday New York Times, and that's about it. And then I find myself reading a lot on my phone and my PC.
Yeah. How about Audible books? You don't have much of a commute.
A lot.
Problem.
No, you know what? I drive my kids to school, and then I come in, and I have the Audible subscription, and my kids and I listen to Audible books. And so we're listening to Where Did You Go, Bernadette, this hilarious novel on audiobook. And before that, we did Eleanor Oliphant is Totally Fine. That's a great novel. And then on my own, I'm listening to the book Titan about the biography of John D. Rockefeller. Oh. Thinking, to learn from an expert historian and how to tell some of these stories. And that's such a long book. I feel I've been listening to it for the last year and a half. It goes very slowly. But I love Audible. I'm a big Audible fan.
Great. So we can maybe look forward to the book in 2021, or if you finish it in 2020, when would it be out?
That's the goal. Yeah. That's the goal. 2021, after the election, a sequel to the Everything Store. A lot of story to tell. Still continues to fascinate me, as I'm sure it does you. And I'm hoping, I can produce something that lives up to the quality of the first book.
Fantastic. Well, I can't wait to see it. Good luck with it.
Thank you, Len. Good talking to you.
Since Darlene was here in the living room with me by the fire, and the interview was pretty short, I thought, well, maybe she and I can have a little conversation about the interview as a way to go a little deeper into it. And she was kind enough to do that before heading up to bed where she is now. So I'm trying to speak softly. The walls are thin here in the old cottage. Ask me a question.
What was the most interesting thing about the interview for you?
I'm pretty interested in how he is going to mix information about Jeff Bezos' personal life, specifically the divorce and some of the other things, and this kind of drier biography of a company. And I liked the fact that he was saying, oh, no, I have to mention the divorce, but I'm not spending all my time on it. I fear that if his editors at the publishing company are going to want a bunch of that stuff because they'll think it'll sell the book. And Brad is a terrific reporter. He in the last book, he found a secret memo, and he actually went through the trash outside the Blue Origin company. He found something. So he's a very, when he gets on a story, he really pursues it. And I think it's going to be hard for him not to get drawn into the whole drama of the breakup of the marriage. But do you think that that's like fair game if somebody's writing a book about Amazon? How much do you think that it should be about Jeff Bezos' private life?
It sounds to me like Jeff Bezos is more and more not involved in the business as much, that he's off having a life.
Yeah.
And so I think it's interesting when he said, I'm not writing a story about Jeff Bezos, I'm writing a story about Amazon.
Yeah.
And the first one, they weren't two separate things, and this one, it seems like they really are two separate things.
No, that's a good point, because he's spending more time on Blue Origin, and that might be a natural separation compared to the book 6 years ago. Well, then I'll ask you another question. Do you think Amazon should be regulated? That Congress and the government should start, putting controls on them for whatever reason?
I thought it was really interesting when Elizabeth Warren was talking about how if you have a small company, it's really hard to compete with Amazon.
Yeah.
And I wondered how true that was.
Yeah.
And I found myself interested in that. Mm-hmm. So maybe he'll talk about that.
Yeah.
Because if it stops other people from being able to be creative and become successful because of their creativity, then maybe it should be regulated.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think probably Amazon would make the point that the Amazon marketplace, where anybody can sell and take advantage of the fulfillment centers like the one we saw, and there are, I don't know if it's hundreds of thousands at least, businesses that started up with somebody selling something and being able to do the whole thing. Amazon gets a good cut. It's profitable for Amazon, but there are, I think, more than half of the things that you can buy on Amazon.com are not sold by Amazon. And
I'd be curious how profitable that is for those.
Can they really make a
companies.
living?
Yeah. And are they only doing it to stay alive, or how profitable is it compared to just selling their product through their own names?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I think that's why it resonates in the political realm. Elizabeth Warren, lots of other, and he's right. It's sort of a Republican and Democrat talking point, and that if I were Amazon, I would be concerned that it's across the spectrum, and they do have a guy who runs their communications now, Jay Carney, who used to be Obama's press secretary, so he's got a lot of experience about especially the world in Washington, and I think they generally stay out of things. They keep a pretty low profile and let the reputation of the company and its success with its customers speak for itself.
Yeah, I hope he talks about the tax regulations and stuff. I mean, the thing that always comes up is, why is Amazon not paying any taxes? And Amazon is saying we're paying as much taxes as we're supposed to be paying.
Yeah,
which basically means the rules are such that there's loopholes and there's reasons that they're not paying. But it seems really, when people are struggling so much, it seems odd to me that this person that we order from almost daily isn't paying any taxes.
Yeah, I think that's that. a lot of people think, well, that's not right. And what you don't hear that much about is that every tax law that's passed that gives Amazon a chance to reduce its taxes generally is promoting something like job creation. And a lot of it is that governments, local governments, state governments, federal, have said, we're going to try to create jobs by giving companies that create lots of jobs a chance to reduce their taxes. And in the case of a company that's creating as many jobs as Amazon, they can get their taxes down to zero.
And the question is it what's more profitable for the American people, having those tax breaks or not?
Yeah, I remember when I used to help out with economic development in Casper, that the calculation was always that if you can bring a company to town that has 10 jobs and they stay there and, generate revenue and the kids are in the schools and all that, that if you make some incentives available to them at the front end because of the value over time of adding a job to your city, it really pays off. And it may be that those calculations are flawed, and it may be that the sentiment of the country is, no, that's not a good way to reduce taxes to try to get benefits for jobs, and that whole thing has to be looked at. But it irritates me when I hear that said over and over on the campaign trail. And a guy I generally like, Buttigieg, he always says, if you paid $1 in taxes, you paid more than Amazon, and that's not right. And all of those things are set up by Congress for purposes that at the time they thought they made sense. And but it's a time when, like Brad says, people are thinking about these big companies. It makes them uneasy, even the ones they like Amazon and Apple. Mm-hmm. And you just wonder, is this really the best way to organize society in the modern world? And, stay tuned. And by the time his book comes out, I think I could imagine his book, because he's such a thoughtful writer and he's so well-sourced, and that it could be a book that, yes, continues the story of Amazon, but gives some kind of raw material for people to help consider these bigger issues about how should we think about these companies. And a lot to admire, and perhaps at the same time a lot to be uneasy about.
Yeah, and just sort of a history, too, of it.
Yeah, I mean, the story itself it's like a novel. Like he says, in the last 6 years, those numbers are amazing. $150 billion in sales to $1 trillion in sales in just 6 years. Mm-hmm. And, basically, they were still just selling stuff when he wrote the last book, and now they've got cloud service, they've got, AI and Alexa, and I like the fact that he says he's trying to figure out, how did that happen? How did a company that was just selling stuff end up being so dominant in so many different industries? And I was also pleased to say, you got to look to the culture, you got to look to the leadership and figure out maybe there are some lessons to be learned generally. I thought it was interesting that he has gone back to reading on paper. He wanted to find out if maybe I thought if I said, oh yeah, I'm reading half of my books on paper now, that I could have been on a story that he would be writing, but he might have been disappointed to hear I'm still 99% Kindle.
Well, how much does he travel?
He probably travels a lot. He's based in San Francisco, so I'm sure when he travels he's got a Kindle, but maybe he's talking about the time that he reads at home.
But if he travels a lot, the majority of the time he would be reading traveling.
Yeah.
And I just don't get why you would carry a book.
Right.
Even if it's just a paper book. Yeah. I just can't imagine why you would do that when you can have a variety of books at your fingertip. That's never made any sense to me, and it still doesn't.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you. This has been nice. We've been sitting by the fire this evening, and it's a quiet night because all the people have gone home from their vacations. There's no families, there's no kids running around. We've got all their toys still in the cabin. And sometimes I step on them in my bare feet. That's a truck under my foot. They've all gone back to Cambridge, and this is kind of a nice time of year up here.
a little bit of fall. It's really nice, though.
Yeah.
Enough sun that you still want to be out and sit.
Yeah. And we were feeling lazy. We realized that our favorite pizza place in Portland, Otto's, would deliver. Pizza was a little cold by the time I got here, but
didn't stop us from eating it. Well, and one advantage of this cold weather is it's good for sleeping, so you're probably going to go upstairs and sleep while I finish this up. I totally am.
Thank you. Good night. I'll close by sharing an email that I received from listener Tom Semple in response to one of the news stories last week, when it was a story in the Washington Post about how Amazon was aggressively promoting its own products at Amazon Marketplace. Tom wrote, "My take on the Washington Post article is that the main source, James Thompson, is not exactly impartial. He has a product to sell. The Facebook page says, quote, build your brand on Amazon. So, of course, he is going to overstate the impact of Amazon-branded products and placement. And Jay Green, that was the reporter, is, of course, happy to stir the Amazon pot to generate interest in his articles, noting that columnists don't always have final say on article titles." Right? Right, that's exactly right. Tom continues, "I regularly purchase Amazon Basics products, computer accessories, batteries, and recently a memory foam mattress. The quality is good, and I've never had issue with any of these purchases, apart from some items going out of stock or not available with the properties I'm looking for. I also regularly order items from third-party sellers." A recent podcast episode of The Land of Giants, that's the podcast that I told you about a week or so ago, covered some of this territory as well. But as large of a marketplace that Amazon.com is, there will always be detractors and critics and concerns. But at this point, I think they are overstated. Amazon surely needs to do better about weeding, but it is never going to be perfect. Antitrust generally targets the impact on consumers. I do not see evidence that consumers are being denied choices, or that Amazon is pushing inferior products or charges too much for them, or sells them at a loss to capture market share, or that they are driving out competitors. Best, Tom. Tom finished with a PS, a podcast recommendation, Sticky Notes by conductor Joshua Wellerstein for classical music lovers and learners. I'll have a link to that in the show notes. And thanks, Tom, for that message. Well, I think that's about it. I am looking forward to hearing David Peach's report from Digital Book World in Nashville. Sorry I won't be there in person this year, but probably by next year the conference will be even bigger and better if Bradley Metrock's crew continues to grow it in such a effective way. They took it over last year. They purchased the show, which had been held in New York, and one of the people that's going to be at the show this year is Mike Chatskin, who was involved in kind of the original vision for the show and put it together and made all the choices for content for a number of years. We will be here in Ocean Park for another quiet week in September. Darlene's sister Deb is visiting from Omaha, and we might be doing a little touring around Maine to see some of the sights. Not going to be any foliage really visible yet. That comes more in October. And we might be seeing some high seas coming as Dorian makes her way pretty far to the east of here, I think, as she ends her dramatic voyage from the Caribbean. Hope you've had a good week, and that's about it for this episode. This is Len Edgerly in Ocean Park for the Kindle Chronicles. Thanks a lot for listening. Bye.